Hello, so we're going to have a look at this question with regards to the WTO and whether a country joining the WTO would improve a country's economic development. So first of all, we want to start our answer off by having a look at what is economic development, and specifically we're going to want to make sure that we refer back to economic development throughout our response, and in particular we want to be thinking about the Human Development Index. And obviously we want to start our essay off by giving a little bit of information about the World Trade Organization and what they stand for. Ultimately their main goal is trade liberalization. And obviously what we mean by trade liberalization is we're looking to make international trade as free as possible. So obviously removing protectionist policies where possible. So let's first of all start off why a country joining the WTO would achieve economic development. So a country joining the WTO, as we said, there would elements of free trade, and what we would therefore expect is we'd expect to see foreign direct investment by multinational corporations. So in order to benefit from the free trade elements that would be achieved by joining the WTO, we would expect multinational firms to invest in countries to take advantage of that free trade. Obviously, that investment would increase a country's long-run aggregate supply curve and increase the productive potential of the economy. Because obviously that foreign direct investment, you were going to see a large increase in the quantity and quality of capital, for example. So these multinational corporations will bring over their machinery, for example, which may be far superior to what's already in the country. And also we will see a greater quantity of capital as well. Obviously, we can draw a long-run aggregate supply curve to demonstrate the point that we're talking about. And obviously we can refer to the diagram in our explanation. So we've got our original long-run aggregate supply curve, we've got our aggregate demand curve, and all we're going to do is quite literally shift out our long-run aggregate supply curve to LRAS1, and we'll draw an outwards arrow there. We'll add in our equilibrium to Y to Y1. There we go. P to P1, downward arrow there. And there we go there. Okay, so with regards to this outward shift of long-run aggregate supply, we've gone from LRAS to LRAS1. And what we see is an extension along the aggregate demand curve. As a result, we see a decrease in the price level from P to P1, obviously representing a decrease in cost push inflation. And what we also see is an increase in real GDP. Obviously, and that's represented by an increase in Y to Y1. And what that increase in real GDP represents is it represents long-run economic growth, an increase in long-run economic growth. And it also represents a reduction in unemployment. Because as we know, labour is there is a derived demand for labour when an economy is growing. So that's all well and good, and we've looked at lots of economic impacts, but we haven't yet linked back to economic development. So we should make sure we link back to economic development. And in the Human Development Index, one of the measures of economic development is gross national income per capita. So obviously with a fall in unemployment, we would expect a rise in GNI per capita. And obviously, as just mentioned, that is a aspect of the Human Development Index. So therefore, we'd expect a rise in the Human Development Index, and therefore we would have achieved economic development. So we can quite clearly see there is benefits to a country joining the WTO, because foreign firms will tend to invest in that economy, and that would allow for economic development to be achieved. However, we should consider that there are some potential issues here, so we will evaluate whether it's all going to be so good. And I'll just draw a line here just to separate the 2 points off so we can quite clearly see the difference between the two. So what multinational corporations tend to do is, though, they tend to exploit resources in particular countries. So, for example, you may find lots of Chinese multinational corporations have set up in Africa, for example, obviously looking to exploit the natural resources in Africa. And as a result, they're just going to pummel the resources that those countries in Africa have, and ultimately it's going to reduce the long-term productive potential of those African economies, because those resources are just going to be extracted and they won't be there for future generations. Exploit resources, natural resources, extracted, not sustainable. Natural resource, not sustainable. And actually what you'd see is, as I said, there'd be a decrease in the long-run supply curve, because there would be a decrease in productive potential. And obviously, we could then draw a diagram to represent that. Put price level there. We can put long-run aggregate supply curve. Draw it. Give it inwards this time. LRAS1. Inwards arrow. We'll put our aggregate demand curve there. Real GDP. Y to Y1. There we go. And increase in the price level. So what we see here is we see that there is a decrease in the long-run aggregate supply, LRAS to LRAS1. We see a reduction in real GDP, Y to Y1, obviously representing a decrease in long-run economic growth. And we would see a rising unemployment, again, because there's a derived demand for labour with regards to economic growth. So if economic growth is falling, there's going to be a reduced demand, therefore, for labour. And obviously, unemployment would therefore rise. And obviously, we'd see an increase in the price level, P to P1, and that would be representative increased cost push inflation. And obviously what we're seeing here is that the unemployment rising would reduce GNI per capita. And therefore that would lower the Human Development Index. So multinational corporations are great in the sense that they can bring foreign direct investment. And obviously that can improve a long-run economic growth within a country, because it improves the productive potential. With regards to hiring more workers, and obviously workers benefiting from a an increased income, improving GNI per capita, and therefore achieving economic development. However, we must be careful that multinational corporations tend to exploit resources, particularly natural resources, and obviously that can reduce the long-term productive potential of an economy, and actually that may formally lower the GNI per capita. So we do need to be careful with multinational corporations and how they impact upon economic development. So let's consider another point now, and we'll just separate that off there. So obviously with multinational corporations setting up and obviously joining the WTO, we'd expect to see a rising number of exports. Obviously, a rising number of exports should therefore improve a country's aggregate demand, because there should be an increased volume and value. We like to use those terms, volume and value, because obviously the aggregate demand function takes into account the value of exports. If the value of exports rises, we should see an increase in aggregate demand. Price level, real GDP, long run aggregate supply curve, AD, AD1, outward shift, Y1, P. Oh, a little bit of an increase in price level. The diagram I've drawn. There we go. So, increase in AD, we go from AD to AD1. We see an extension along the long run aggregate supply curve. We see an increase in real GDP, Y2, Y1, and obviously that is representative of an increase, in this case, short-run economic growth. And obviously we're well aware that that there's a derived demand for labour when there's economic growth, so therefore there'll be a reduction in unemployment, and that reduction in unemployment, as previously mentioned, would lead to an increase in GNI per capita, which, as we've already mentioned, should therefore increase the Human Development Index measure and therefore be representative of economic development. So there we go. We've covered that point quite quickly, but it just builds upon what we've previously talked about. But the idea here is that exports should increase by a country joining the WTO, and therefore exports, the volume and value of exports increasing, should lead to a reduction in unemployment, and therefore GNI per capita should increase, and therefore HDI increases, and as a result economic development is achieved. However, there should be a word of warning with regards to unemployment falling, because actually a country, by joining the WTO, may open itself up to actually having structural unemployment. So what we mean and why we say that is obviously structural. When the removal of protectionist policies. So removal of protectionism obviously opens a country up to fierce competition, and there may actually be another country which may have a comparative advantage in producing a certain product, and therefore that other country would be the one that produces and trades that particular product, and then therefore the country who previously produced it but didn't have a comparative advantage would therefore have to find a new comparative advantage, and therefore as a result would cause large amounts of unemployment, particularly structural unemployment. So removal of protectionism, other countries better suited to producing a product, so the country must find a new product to specialise in, and therefore creates large amounts of structural unemployment because workers will have to retrain in order to work in the new industry that the economy is going to specialise in. So workers will have to retrain. Obviously, this large amounts of unemployment causes a reduction in the gross national income per capita. And again, that's going to lower the Human Development Index, and economic development is going to suffer. So really important to consider that when joining the World Trade Organization, obviously removal of protectionist policies should encourage trade, and that can generate employment opportunities and therefore reduce unemployment and improve people's GNI per capita, or improve the GNI per capita of the country and achieve economic development. However, opening a country up to competition from around the world is risky, because there is potential that another country in the world may be better suited to producing a certain product, and as a result may lead to structural unemployment, and obviously GNI per capita would therefore fall, and there wouldn't be any economic development. We'd actually be going in backwards. So let's consider some other points we may wish to talk about in our response. Obviously, with businesses setting up in a particular country in order to benefit from the free trade, we're going to generate tax revenue. The economy is going to generate tax revenue from those multinational firms. So MNCs pay taxes due to operations. So this leads to increased tax revenue for the government. And obviously the government can then use that tax revenue to spend where it likes. So it could spend on education. It could spend on healthcare. Okay, so if it's spent on education, it could increase the mean number of years of schooling. And if it's spent on healthcare, it could increase life expectancy. So that may be due to, obviously, increased life expectancy due to increased number of hospitals, for example, and therefore it may be more accessible to treat people for certain infections, for example, and therefore people should hopefully start to live longer. Main number of years of schooling could increase. Again, maybe it's more accessible, so there's an increased number of schools, for example, that have been built, and therefore more people are able to access education, and therefore the country has the necessary infrastructure within regards to the educational sector that pupils can attend school for a prolonged period of time. And what these would do, mean number of years of schooling and life expectancy, are all measures of the Human Development Index. So obviously the Human Development Index would rise and economic development would be achieved, and that's been possible due to joining the World Trade Organization, because the World Trade Organization has meant there's free trade that's attracted multinational corporations who wish to take advantage of the country joining the WTO and the free trade aspect. They're going to pay taxes, and those the tax revenue generated for the government can be spent on education and healthcare, which can be used to therefore improve economic development. Obviously we should consider, so evaluating this point here about economic development being achieved, we should be concerned that obviously multinational corporations tend to find tax loopholes and obviously those tax loopholes or incentives offered by governments to also reduce the amount of tax revenue potential, and therefore ultimately not as much tax revenue is generated, and therefore not as much spending can be put in place with regards to education and healthcare. Another particular issue with regards to obviously joining the World Trade Organization is there could be a downward pressure on wages. So this downward pressure on wages may occur because firms look to become more internationally competitive. So in order for firms to become internationally competitive, because they're obviously, by joining the World Trade Organization, they're opened up to competition from overseas, they look to become more competitive. So therefore, as a result, they may reduce their wages in order to reduce their costs, to therefore lower their price, for example. Okay, but that comes at the detriment of lower wages, and obviously those lower wages therefore may lead to rises in inequality, and it may even lead to rises in poverty, maybe both absolute and relative poverty. So again, economic development isn't being achieved if joining the WTO causes wages to be pushed down. And then finally, we may wish to consider that obviously joining the WTO may not necessarily be the best option, and it's kind of been touched upon previously, but we may want to include a diagram here to support that. So opens industries up to international competition and removal of tariffs. So let's draw a tariff diagram first of all. So we've got quantity, we've got price, we've got demand, we've got supply, we've got so we've got world supply plus tariff. We'll put our quantities in. We'll label that area 1, 2, 3, 4. We'll call this Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. We'll call that P1, and we'll call that P2. Okay, so obviously when joining the WTO, there is a removal of tariffs. Removal of tariffs, so the price falls from P2 to P1, and what we see that the quantity supplied by domestic firms would decrease from Q2 to Q1, and producer surplus would fall by area 1. So by joining the WTO, obviously this is a negative impact that we're discussing here of joining the WTO. Obviously the removal of the tariffs, the price would fall from P2 to P1. Quantity supplied by domestic firms would decrease from Q2 to Q1, and the producer surplus would decrease by area 1. What that would mean, obviously, is there's a lower output by domestic firms, and therefore less demand for labour, and as a result there may be increases in unemployment, which obviously, as we've mentioned before, would lead to that lower GNI per capita, which obviously doesn't achieve economic development. However, we may wish to consider here that obviously, even though the economic development in the sense of GNI per capita has fallen, there is an increased choice, and there may be improved quality due to an increased number of imports. So the number of imports would rise. Imports would rise from Q3 minus Q2 to Q4 minus Q1. So the number of imports would rise, and that may give a better choice and a better quality of products, and therefore that may improve standards of living, which may lead to economic development. So we just need to sum up our response, looking at a judgment. And all our judgment would be, is joining the WTO, is it good or bad? And explain why. And you may say it depends on, well, you may argue it depends on whether a comparative advantage can be maintained. Because obviously if a comparative advantage can be maintained, there would be no structural unemployment. There would be no structural unemployment because obviously you continue producing the good that you specialise in, and you may actually see a further increase in output and then a further reduction in unemployment. Okay, so just to recap, the question we were looking at was evaluate whether joining the WTO would increase a country's economic development. We started our answer off by talking a little bit about the WTO, what they stand for, and how we measure economic development. Then we had a look at obviously multinational corporations being attracted by the free trade, encouraged by the WTO, and obviously multinational corporations would bring foreign direct investment, which would increase employment opportunities, and obviously that could lead to improved GNI per capita, which could therefore improve economic development. However, we did argue that some multinational corporations tend to exploit resources, and actually that may decrease the long-run productive potential of an economy and have a negative impact, therefore, on employment opportunities. The free trade elements may also bring benefits with regards to increased volume and value of trade, in particular increase the number of exports, and again that increasing volume and value of exports should generate employment opportunities, and again benefit GNI per capita, which should improve HDI. But we did argue that there may be a case that obviously opening a country up to more competition now due to free trade being promoted by the WTO may lead to large amounts of structural unemployment because another country may be better suited to producing a good or service, and as a result there may be mass unemployment whilst the country that's joined the WTO finds a new comparative advantage or a new area to specialise in. Coming towards the end, obviously multinational corporations tend to will pay taxes due to operations in a particular country. Obviously they're operating there to take advantage of the free trade that's promoted by the WTO, and that tax revenue can be therefore spent on things such as education and healthcare, which can improve the Human Development Index with regards to improvements in life expectancy and the number of years in schooling. But obviously we've got to be careful that multinational corporations tend to look to find tax loopholes, and the tax revenue that's generated is lower than what could have potentially been raised. Other issues with regards to joining the WTO is that wages may be forced downwards due to firms facing international competition, and that may therefore lead to rising inequality and increasing rates of poverty. And then finally we looked at another drawback with regards to the removal of tariffs. Domestic production is going to fall in certain industries, and that therefore may lead to rising unemployment in certain industries. However, consumers may find a greater choice and quality of imports, therefore improving their standards of living. And finally, we came to the conclusion that we would make a conclusion whether joining the WTO was good or bad, and explain why. And I argued that potentially it would depend on whether a comparative advantage can be maintained, because if a comparative advantage can be maintained, there wouldn't be any structural unemployment, because that country would be the most competitive in that particular product. So, thank you very much.